The notification came at 11:47 on a Tuesday night, while I was sitting in a plastic chair that had probably held 1,000 people before me, all of them waiting for news they weren't sure they wanted to hear. My phone was face down on my knee. I'd been staring at the door at the end of the hallway for the better part of 2 hours, watching nurses move in and out of it with the kind of calm efficiency that only made the waiting worse. My son-in-law, Derek, had gone to get coffee 20 minutes ago and hadn't come back. I assumed he was standing somewhere alone, trying to hold himself together before he had to come back and pretend he was fine. I understood that. I'd been doing the same thing from the chair. My granddaughter, Lily, was 7 years old, and on the other side of that door, she collapsed at school that afternoon. A seizure, they'd told us at first. Then they'd stopped saying words like probably and likely, and started saying words like imaging and specialist and we want to be thorough. I'd driven 40 minutes to get here and had not moved from this chair since. My phone buzzed. I turned it over out of habit, the way you do when you're waiting and every vibration feels like it might be news. It wasn't a call. It was a banking alert. A withdrawal notification from the joint account my wife Patricia and I had shared for 31 years. $14,000 transferred out. 11:46 p.m. I read it twice. Then I read it a third time, because numbers that large have a way of not registering correctly the first time you see them, especially when you've been awake since 6 in the morning and your granddaughter is in a hospital room down the hall. I told myself there was an explanation. Patricia was sensible with money. She'd been the one to set up the automatic payments, the one who noticed when a subscription renewed without us meaning to keep it. $14,000 disappearing from our account at midnight was not something Patricia did by accident. I called her. It rang 4 times and went to voicemail. I sat with the phone in my hand and looked back at the door at the end of the hallway. Derek came back with 2 coffees and held one out to me. I took it. I didn't say anything about the notification. I didn't know what to say yet, and Lily was still on the other side of that door, and nothing else was allowed to be the most important thing right now. But I checked the account balance. What had been there that morning was not there anymore. Patricia and I had been married for 31 years. We met when I was 32 and she was 29, at a work function neither of us particularly wanted to attend. We'd spent most of the evening standing near the same window, both of us looking for a polite way to leave, and by the time we'd talked ourselves into staying until 9 o'clock, I'd already decided I wanted to see her again. We had one daughter, Renee. Renee had married Derek 8 years ago, and they'd given us Lily, who was the loudest and most opinionated 7-year-old I had ever encountered, and I meant that entirely as a compliment. I had retired 3 years ago from 30 years in civil engineering. Patricia had worked in hospital administration until her own retirement 2 years back. We lived in the same house we'd bought in 1998. We drove sensible cars. We had a savings account and a modest investment portfolio, and a joint checking account that I had not looked at closely enough, apparently. By the time the doctor came out to tell us that Lily had a febrile seizure and was stable and resting and we could see her shortly, it was nearly 2 in the morning. Derek went in first. I stayed in the hallway and called Patricia again. She didn't answer. I texted her. Lily is stable. Where are you? I've been trying to reach you. There's a transaction on the account I need you to explain. I watched the message show as delivered, then as read. She didn't respond. I drove home at 3 in the morning. The house was dark. Her car was gone. Her closet, I found when I turned on the light, was not empty. But it was noticeably less full than it had been that morning. The kind of less full that doesn't happen by accident. I sat on the edge of the bed for a long time. Then I went to my desk and I opened the laptop and I looked at every account we had one by one. The checking account was gutted. The savings account, which I had not checked in several weeks because Patricia handled the transfers, was down to $412. Our joint brokerage account, the one we'd spent the better part of a decade building carefully for retirement, showed a series of liquidations going back 11 days. Not all at once. Gradually. The way you drain something when you don't want anyone to notice until it's done. Gone. All of it, or close enough to all of it that the difference didn't comfort me. I sat at that desk until the sky outside the window started to go gray, and I thought about the last 11 days. I thought about whether there had been signs, Patricia had been quieter than usual, maybe. She'd been taking more calls in the other room. She'd mentioned once that an old friend from her administration days had reached out. I had not asked the friend's name. I had not thought to. I was 63 years old and I had not thought to. I was 63 years old and I had not thought to. When it was a reasonable hour, I called my daughter. She'd been home from the hospital a few hours, she said. Lily was doing better. Then I told her, as carefully as I could, what I had found. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. "Dad," she said, "what do you mean she's gone? I mean her car isn't in the driveway and her things are partially cleared out and the accounts are empty and she isn't answering my calls." Another silence. "I don't understand," Renee said. "I don't understand," Renee said. "I don't either," I said. "Not yet." I found out where she was 4 days later, not from her, but from her sister, Margaret, who called me with the careful tone of someone who had debated making the call for longer than was comfortable. "I think you should know," Margaret said, "because I think it's wrong that you don't." Patricia was in Scottsdale, Arizona. She was staying with a man named Gary who had been, as best Margaret could piece together, a relationship that had existed in some form for approximately 2 years. Gary had recently retired from a financial consulting firm. He had a house in Scottsdale. He had apparently been making plans. Patricia had been making plans too. "How long have you known?" I asked Margaret. 3 weeks, she said. "She told me she was leaving. I told her she needed to tell you herself." "I didn't know about the money, Robert. I want you to understand that. I didn't know about the money." I believed her. Margaret had never been a person who could look me in the eye and lie, and she'd been looking me in the eye, metaphorically, across 31 years of holidays and family dinners and graduations, and she sounded genuinely sick about this. I thanked her. I hung up. Then I called a lawyer. Her name was Carol, and a colleague had recommended her with the specific words, "She's the one you want when the other side has already started moving." I sat across from her desk on a Thursday afternoon, and I laid out everything I had. The account statements, the withdrawal history, the liquidation timeline, the dates, the amounts. Carol looked at all of it without changing her expression. "She's been liquidating for 11 days before the final transfer," she said. "That's what it looks like. Did you have any agreement, written or otherwise, about either of you making withdrawals of this size unilaterally?" "No." "And the brokerage account? Both names?" "Both names." Carol made several notes. "This is dissipation of marital assets," she said. "What she's done here, particularly the systematic liquidation before departure, is going to be very relevant to the division of what remains. I want to file immediately, and I want to send a preservation letter today." "She hasn't contacted me," I said. "Not once. Not to explain. Not to tell me where she is. My granddaughter was in the hospital that night, and I sat there for hours, and she knew I was there, and she didn't call." Carol looked up from her notes. "I know," she said quietly. "I'm sorry. I just want you to understand the kind of thing we're dealing with." "I do," she said, "and I want you to let me handle all communication with her from this point forward. No calls, no texts, no reaching out. Whatever you want to say to her, you say it through me." I nodded. "That won't be a problem. I won't pretend the weeks that followed were easy. They were not. There is a specific kind of disorientation that comes from living in a house you shared with someone for 25 years and suddenly navigating it alone, not because something terrible happened to them, but because they chose to leave and took everything they could carry on the way out. I cooked meals I didn't finish. I went to bed at a reasonable hour and woke up at 3 in the morning anyway. I had coffee with Renee on Saturday mornings, and I watched Lily draw at the kitchen table with the focused concentration of someone solving a very serious problem, and those Saturday mornings were, for a while, the clearest part of each week. Lily had recovered fully. The specialist had cleared her, had explained what had happened and why it was unlikely to happen again, and what to watch for just in case. She had gone back to school. She had declared, with the authority only a 7-year-old can bring to a statement, that hospitals were boring and they don't even have good crackers. And I had agreed with her completely. she asked once, carefully, in the way children ask things when they already sense the answer is complicated, whether Grandma Patricia was coming to her birthday. "Not this year, sweetheart," I told her. She thought about that for a moment. Then she went back to her drawing. Through Carol, I learned that Patricia had retained her own attorney, a man named Philip, who sent a letter suggesting a mediated settlement. The letter used phrases like mutual recognition and equitable resolution, and carefully avoided using the word theft, which I found instructive. Carol drafted the response. I didn't see it before it went because that was our arrangement, but Carol told me afterward that it addressed point by point the 11-day liquidation timeline and requested a full accounting of every transfer and the destination accounts. The mediation request went quiet for 2 weeks. Then Philip sent a second letter. Patricia was, it explained, prepared to acknowledge certain transfers and propose returning a portion of the funds as part of a broader settlement that would allow both parties to move forward cleanly. "A portion," I said. "That's what it says," Carol confirmed. "What portion? They haven't specified." I leaned back in the chair. "What are our options?" Carol had been doing this for a long time, and she had the practiced calm of someone who'd watched a great many people sit in that chair and ask that exact question. "We go to litigation," she said. "We lay out the dissipation case. We subpoena the account records. We let the court see exactly what she did and when she did it. Judges don't generally look kindly on systematic asset removal, particularly when it was conducted over nearly 2 weeks with apparent premeditation." "Then that's what we do," I said. The account records, once subpoenaed, told a story that was more complete than I'd been able to piece together on my own. The liquidations had begun not 11 days before she left, as I'd originally calculated, but 19. She'd started with smaller amounts, the kind that wouldn't trigger an alert. Transfers to an account I hadn't known existed, an individual account in her name only, opened 14 months prior. The final large transfers, including the $14,000 I'd seen on my phone in the hospital hallway, were the last step of a process that had been running quietly for the better part of 3 weeks. Gary's financial background was evident in the methodology, the escalation pattern, the timing of transfers to avoid alert thresholds, the use of a separately held account as a staging point. These were not the instincts of someone who'd acted impulsively. This had been planned. Carol presented all of it to the court. She also presented something I hadn't known to look for, a series of communications, obtained through discovery, between Patricia and Gary going back 2 years and 4 months. Not just the relationship itself, but specific conversations about financial strategy, specific conversations about our accounts, specific conversations about timing. Patricia's attorney objected to several things during those proceedings. The judge overruled most of them. I did not attend every hearing. Carol had advised me that my presence at all of them was unnecessary, and that, in some instances, it was better for me not to be in the room. I accepted this guidance. I was 63 years old, and I had been an engineer for 3 decades, and I had learned, somewhere in all of those years, that the most effective thing you can do in a complex situation is identify the person who knows more than you do, and then get out of their way. I spent those months doing what I could do. I handled the house, attended the yard. I went to Lily's soccer games on Saturday afternoons and sat in a folding chair on the sideline next to Derek and watched her run back and forth with the uncomplicated joy of someone who has not yet learned to run toward anything other than the ball. I called Margaret occasionally. She was embarrassed, I think, by the degree to which her sister's actions had unfolded after that first phone call, and she apologized more than was necessary. I told her she'd done the right thing by calling me. I meant it. She told me, once, that Patricia had reached out to her and that the conversation had not gone well. She wanted me to understand her perspective, Margaret said. I told her I understood it fine, I just didn't agree with it. I didn't ask for more details than that. The settlement, when it finally came, was not what Patricia's attorney had initially proposed. The court found, based on the documentation Carol had presented, that the transfers constituted intentional dissipation of marital assets and ordered restitution, not a portion. A full accounting, applied against Patricia's share of the remaining marital estate, The house, which she had apparently expected to receive half of, she did not receive half of. She did not receive half of. The retirement account that remained, which she had apparently expected to divide evenly, she did not divide evenly. Gary, I learned through the proceedings, had moved approximately $40,000 of the transferred funds into a joint investment he and Patricia had opened in Arizona. The court's reach in that direction was limited but not absent. Carol was thorough. Patricia called me the day after the final order was issued. I let it go to voicemail. She left a message that lasted 4 minutes and 20 seconds. I listened to it once, standing in the kitchen with a cup of coffee going cold on the counter. She said she hadn't meant for things to happen this way. She said she'd been unhappy for a long time. She said she hoped I could understand, someday, that she'd been trying to find a way out and hadn't known how to ask for one. She said she was sorry about the money, though she used softer language than that. She said she hoped I was doing okay. She didn't mention Lily. She didn't ask about the seizure or the hospital or the night she'd driven away while I sat in a plastic chair reading a withdrawal notification on my phone. I deleted the message. I did not call back. The house sold 8 months after the final order because keeping it no longer made sense for what my life had become. I bought a smaller place, a single-story ranch on a quiet street 20 minutes from Renee and Derek, with a yard modest enough to manage without a riding mower and a spare room that Lily had already claimed as hers for overnight visits, had already filled, partially, with a collection of drawings she'd done and left there on purpose, papering the lower half of the wall in careful crayon renditions of horses and one very serious-looking cat. She came over on a Friday evening about a month after I moved in, and we made pancakes for dinner because she had decided recently that breakfast for dinner was something more grandparents should be willing to offer. I agreed that this was probably true. She sat at the kitchen counter on a stool that was slightly too tall for her and supervised the batter with the gravity of a senior quality control officer. "Grandpa," she said, while I poured the first one onto the griddle. "Yeah. Do you like your new house?" I looked around the kitchen. It was smaller than the one I'd had. The counters were a different color. The window over the sink faced a different direction and caught the late afternoon light in a way the old one never had, turning everything in that corner briefly gold before the sun moved on. "I do," I said. "I really do." She considered this with the seriousness she brought to most things. Then she said, "Good," and returned her full attention to the pancake. I am not a person who uses words like closure, because I've never entirely believed in it as a discrete event. The idea that a door closes cleanly and you walk away from it and something is finished. What I believe in at 63, having watched a great many things end and a few things begin in the years since, is something quieter than that. Less like a door closing and more like the gradual understanding that you have, without particularly deciding to, started looking in a different direction. There is still a version of Patricia that lives in the 31 years we shared, the woman who stood near a window at a work function in 1993 and told me, with a dry honesty I'd found immediately disarming, that she was only staying until she could think of a graceful exit. The woman who sat up with Renee through 3-year infections and 2 stomach viruses and never once complained about the lost sleep. The woman who had, for a long time, been the person I called first when anything happened, good or bad. I don't know how to reconcile those two things into one coherent picture, and I've stopped trying to force it. What I know is what happened. The records are clear. The timeline is clear. Whatever she had felt, whatever had been breaking down in ways I hadn't seen or hadn't known to look for, what she chose to do with it was to leave on a Tuesday night while my granddaughter was in the hospital and take everything she could before I noticed. I noticed, and I stood up from that plastic chair eventually. I drove home. I opened a laptop. I called a lawyer. I showed up, 1 week at a time, to pancake dinners and soccer games and Saturday mornings in my daughter's kitchen. I got through it the way most people get through the thing they were sure would break them. Not all at once, but in increments, each one small enough to manage, until one day you look up and the distance between where you are and where that started is long enough that it feels, finally, like the past. Lily's drawings are still on the wall in the spare room. I haven't taken them down. I don't intend to. People ask me sometimes what the hardest part was. They expect me to say the money. Or the silence. 31 years of marriage ending without a single phone call. Not even a message to ask whether Lily had made it through the night. Those things were hard, but the hardest part was simpler than any of that. It was sitting at that desk at 3 in the morning and understanding that the version of events I had been living in was not the version that was actually true. That is a specific kind of loss. Not the loss of a person exactly, but the loss of the story you believed you were both inside. And there is no clean way through that. You just have to sit with it until it becomes something you can carry, rather than something that is carrying you. What I've come to believe, having had enough time and enough quiet to think it through, is that the consequences Patricia faced were not punishment. They were simply the natural result of the choices she made. She chose to plan in secret over 19 days. She chose to move methodically and deliberately. She chose to leave on the precise night when I was least able to respond. Every one of those choices had a logic to it. But every one of them also left a record. And records, as Carol understood far better than Patricia apparently did, tell the whole story whether you want them to or not. Integrity is not something you perform when people are watching. It is what you do with the information no one else has access to yet. Patricia had access to information I didn't have. She knew what was coming. She knew about Gary, about the account she'd opened 14 months before, about the plan that had been building quietly while we shared dinners and watched the news and talked about nothing in particular. What she chose to do with that advantage was take as much as she could before I understood the situation. And what that choice revealed more clearly than anything else was the distance between the person I had believed I knew and the person who had actually been there. I don't say this with bitterness. I say it because it matters. The choices we make when no one is checking, when there is no immediate consequence, when we believe we can simply leave before the account comes due, those choices are not invisible. They accumulate. They show up in subpoenaed records and courtroom documents, and in the face of a 7-year-old who asks with careful eyes whether Grandma Patricia is coming to her birthday. What carried me through was not any single moment of resolve. It was smaller than that. It was the decision, made again each morning, to stand up and be present for the people who were still there. Renee, Derek, Lily and her crayon horses and her very serious-looking cat, the attorney who told me to let her handle it and turned out to be exactly right, the sister-in-law who made a phone call she didn't have to make because she believed I deserved to know. Dignity, I have learned, is mostly just that. Showing up. Telling the truth. Letting the work speak. Not because anyone is watching, but because you are. And that turns out to be enough.